Some women wear black for grief. She wore white, not to forget what she lost, but to remind the world she still carried it. They called her heartless, said she had gold in her chest instead of blood, but no one ever asked how it felt to set a table for four and eat alone. So when the orphan train arrived, and no one stepped forward for the last three boys, she did, not because they needed her, but because she still needed someone to call her home. The air at Elkhorn Station smelled of dust, sweat, and hot iron. The train had been late, always was, and now the townsfolk waited like they were picking livestock. Strong boys, quiet girls, arms checked, teeth judged. Children lined up like they owed something to the world just for surviving it. And then she arrived. Not in haste, not in pity, but like a woman who knew her place in the world, and had built it brick by brick. Eleanor Baines, the richest widow between Kansas and Missouri. Her arrival didn't turn heads, it stopped conversation. Not because of scandal, but because of silence. No one expected her to come, especially not he. She stepped down from a black carriage, its brass handles polished like mirrors. Her dress, soft cream silk, whispered around her ankles. Her gloves, snow white. Her hat, veiled. No dust dared touch her hem. No wind messed her hair. People moved aside, like paper before flame. She said nothing, didn't smile, didn't nod. Just walked toward the wooden platform where the last three boys stood, unsold, unwanted, and quietly waiting for the train to take them back. The first boy was maybe 10, tall for his age, but too thin. He looked at the ground like it owed him a debt he'd never collect. The second, maybe 7, clenched his fists like he was holding something in. A cry, or maybe a scream. No one knew. The last one, barely 5. He had doubt on his cheeks like freckles, eyes that never stayed still. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stood there, like if he moved, he might dissipate. Eleanor's eyes scanned the boys, not with the gaze of charity or curiosity, but like a woman recognizing a reflection in a fogged-up mirror. The auctionee, a sweating man with too tight boots, cleared his throat. "These ones ain't strong," he said, almost apologetic. Sickly, one of 'em don't talk. Most folks took the able-bodied ones for field work. "You sure?" Eleanor Baines turned her head slowly. "I am not most folks," she said. She removed one of her gloves with practiced grace, reached into her silk handbag, and pulled out a folded paper. "3 placements," she said calmly. "Paid in full." The boys looked up, not in hope, but confusion. They had not been chosen before, not once. They did not understand kindness that didn't ask for something in return. She stepped closer. The middle boy flinched. The youngest looked past her. The oldest narrowed his eyes. Eleanor knelt. Not low, not begging. Just enough to meet their gaze, eye to eye, as equals. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "If you come with me, you'll have food. A warm place. You won't be worked. You won't be whipped. And you'll never be asked to forget who you were before." The oldest boy frowned. "Why?" "Why what?" she asked. "Why us?" Eleanor paused. The kind of pause that isn't for words, but memory. "Because I once lost a boy no one thought mattered," she said. "And I swore, if I ever had the means, I'd never let that happen again." She didn't ask them to agree. She turned and walked back to the carriage. The boys hesitated. Then the middle one reached for the smallest's hand. The eldest followed behind, steps heavy. The townspeople watched in stiff silence. "She's taking them," one whispered. "Those ones. What's she gonna do with 3 broken boys? She ain't got a husband to help her." Someone else scoffed. "Rich folk always collect strange things." But one old woman, standing in the back, said nothing. She just watched Eleanor's carriage pull away, 3 heads now visible inside, and whispered, "She's not collecting them. She's rebuilding. That night, at the Baines estate, 3 separate beds had already been made. A warm stew was simmering on the stove, and folded at the foot of each bed, a set of clean clothes, a small comb, and a single note handwritten in fine script. You are not here to earn love. You are here because you were already worthy of it. The Baines estate sat at the edge of town, where the wheat fields curled like golden sea waves under the Kansas sun. The house, tall and still, looked more like a portrait than a home. Every window was spotless, every curtain pinned just so. And yet, for all its beauty, it had gone 10 years without a laugh inside its walls. Until now, the boys did not speak the first night. They bathed, one by one, in a clawfoot tub too grand for their bones. They ate, quietly, spooning stew into their mouths like someone might take it back. They wore their new clothes stiffly, like costumes that didn't belong to them. When Eleanor passed through the hall, their eyes followed her, not with trust, but suspicion dressed as silence. She gave them space. She didn't ask for names. She didn't ask what they'd been through. She simply said, "Sleep well," as she passed their rooms that night, her voice steady like a clock ticking after years of stillness. The boys did not say good night, but none of them cried. In the morning, the sun leaked through the cream lace curtains. The house smelled of bread and polished wood, and one by one, the boys rose, not sure if they were still allowed to be there. In the kitchen, they found her. Not a servant, not a maid. Eleanor Baines herself, hair tied in a silk ribbon, apron laced with embroidery, hands gently flour-dusted as she folded dough. The eldest hovered at the door. "You cook?" he asked. Eleanor didn't look up. "I do what needs doing." He nodded slowly. Men usually, in big houses. She met his eyes then, with a calm edge to her smile. "This house," she said, "doesn't run on usually. It runs on truth." The boy didn't know what to do with that, so he sat down, not because he understood her, but because he wanted to. Over the next week, the rhythm of the house shifted. The youngest followed Eleanor like a shadow, never touching, just watching. He'd stand by the window when she read, behind the kitchen door when she hummed. The middle boy spent most hours outside, staring at the horses. Not riding, just standing beside the fence, like he was waiting for the animals to speak. The eldest boy took to books. He read silently in the corner of the study, eyeing her old leather-bound collection like they were locked doors and he was learning how to pick them. Still, none of them spoke of the orphan train. None of them asked why she had picked them. And Eleanor did not ask for affection. She offered care without requirement. Meals, baths, gentle reminders to sleep. Nothing more, nothing less. But it was on the 8th day that something changed. The youngest, the one who hadn't spoken a word since they arrived, wandered into the parlor as Eleanor was playing the piano. Her fingers moved gently across the keys, not in performance, but in memory. He climbed onto the edge of the velvet chair near her and stared. After a long pause, he whispered something. Barely a sound. Eleanor stopped playing, turned slowly, and knelt before him. "Say it again," she asked softly. He looked down, rubbed his thumb against the chair's embroidery. "Can I stay?" She blinked once. "Of course you can," she said. "This is your home now." His lip trembled. "Even if I can't read." Eleanor reached out and touched his hand. Especially then. That night, she asked the boys for their names. She did not demand them. She offered the question like a candle in the dark. The youngest, still curled on the parlor chair, said, "Tommy." The middle boy, arms crossed but eyes soft now, said, "Walt." The eldest waited. Then finally, "Joseph. But people just called me boy before." Eleanor nodded gently. "Well, Joseph, Tommy, Walt. If you'd like, I can call you what you want to become." The room was quiet, but it was no longer cold. By the end of the second week, the house began to breathe again. Walt brushed the horses on his own. Tommy followed Eleanor into town and picked lavender at the market. And Joseph asked if he could write letters, though he had no one to send them to. Eleanor said yes. In town, tongues still wagged. She's lost her mind, one said. Boys like that. Wild, dirty, broken. What's she want with them? But Eleanor never replied to gossip. She only raised her chin and moved through the town like someone who had already buried every opinion that ever tried to define her. One afternoon, as they sat under the willow tree near the stables, Joseph asked a question no one expected. Did you really have a son? Eleanor didn't answer at first. She looked out at the golden horizon, fingers wrapped around a teacup. Yes, she said, but I was poor when he was born, and the world does not treat poor mothers kindly. She took a breath. I was made to choose between feeding him or keeping him, and I chose badly. Tommy climbed into her lap. She didn't stop him. Walt looked down. We weren't chosen before. Eleanor looked at all three of them then, not with pity, but with something closer to awe. I didn't choose you, she said. You chose to stay. The wind carried whispers long before the boys ever heard them. It started in the town square, where Walt reached for a jar of penny sweets and the shopkeeper pulled it away like his fingers were fire. You touch what you pay for, he snapped. Joseph stepped in. We've got coin. The man glanced outside, saw Eleanor's carriage waiting, and scoffed. Rich folk giving strays silver now, huh? Walt's hand curled into a fist. But Joseph just placed the coin on the counter, picked up the jar, and said, We pay either way. They left without speaking, but the silence was heavier than any insult. Later that evening, Eleanor found Walt alone behind the barn, his back turned to the house. You didn't eat, she said softly. He shrugged. Not hungry. She waited. The wind rustled the grass around them like the earth trying to speak gently. I didn't steal, he said suddenly. Not ever. Not before. I know, Eleanor replied. I hate that they look at us like we're animals. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder. Let them look. Let them talk. Let them choke on their smallness. He turned to her, tears just behind the stubbornness. But why does it still hurt? Eleanor knelt, lifting his chin. Because your heart is still soft. That is your power. Never let the world turn it to stone. The next week, Joseph asked if he could attend church with her. She hesitated, not because she didn't want him there, but because she knew what eyes might say when her boys sat in pews meant for old names and old money. But she said yes. Of course she did. She ironed their shirts, polished their boots. She tied Tommy's hair back with a ribbon she used to wear herself. They walked together, not behind her, beside her. And when they entered the chapel, the air bent around them like a storm trying to hold its breath. People shifted in their seats. Some nodded stiffly. Others did not look at all. The pastor's voice faltered when he saw them, but he recovered quickly. Joseph sat straight. Walt crossed his arms but listened. Tommy laid his head in Eleanor's lap halfway through the sermon and fell asleep. She never moved him. But when it ended, and they stood to leave, a woman in a lilac shawl whispered just loud enough. She's making them soft, turning wild dogs into lap pets. Eleanor turned her head. With one look, the room went still. She didn't shout, didn't spit. She simply said, I'd rather raise gentle men than broken ones. And walked out, with all three boys behind her. Later, Joseph asked her something that made her still. If we grow up and leave, will we stop being yours? She looked at him, then at Walt, then at Tommy. No, she said. You'll always be mine. But you'll be alone again, Walt said quietly. Eleanor smiled, not sadly, but with something deeper. My heart is not a room that empties when someone walks out. It is a house that grows every time love lives in it. Tommy whispered, Does it hurt, though, to lose? She nodded. Yes. But not loving at all. That hurts far worse. One evening, rain pounded against the windows. Joseph had a fever. Tommy had fallen asleep against her lap again. Walt sat at the hearth staring into the flames. He finally said, "Why do you do this?" "Do what?" "Keep choosing us, even when it'd be easier not to." She looked at the fire too. Her voice was soft, quieter than the rain. "Because when I was your age, no one chose me. And I remember how that silence felt. I promised myself, if I ever had more than I needed, I'd spend the rest of my life undoing that sound." Walt looked at her. The sound of what? Being unwanted. The boys began to change after that. Not quickly. Not all at once. But in real ways. Walt started waking early to feed the animals before she asked. Joseph taught Tommy to read by candlelight, one page at a time, no matter how long it took. And Tommy began collecting little things. Feathers, dried flowers, smooth stones, placing them on her dresser each morning without a word. Tiny thank yous for what he didn't yet know how to say. One afternoon, a man rode in from another town, asking to see Eleanor. He wore a sheriff's badge, said he'd come regarding the boys, something about record errors, possible return to the state. The boys froze when they heard. Eleanor didn't shout, didn't panic. She simply asked the man to wait on the porch, then turned to her boys. "You are not leaves the wind can carry off," she said. "You are roots now. In this land. In my home. In me." She returned to the porch and handed the sheriff a stack of signed, sealed documents, each boy officially adopted under her name. He frowned. "You planned ahead." She looked him dead in the eye. "I don't improvise with people I love." The man tipped his hat. "They are lucky." "No," she said quietly. "I am." That night, Walt carved something into the tree near the stable. It wasn't his name. Just one word. Ours. Time passed, not in leaps, but in small, honest steps. The house that once echoed only with silence now pulsed with life. Joseph grew tall, quiet and observant, his words few but weighted. He began to wear waistcoats and keep ledgers for the ranch's accounts, asking Eleanor questions she once thought only men would dare ask her. Walt found strength in his hands. He fixed fences before she noticed they were broken. He'd walk the perimeter at dusk like a soldier protecting something sacred. Tommy, ever tender, spent hours in the garden she'd once neglected, planting rows of soft-colored flowers, drawing bees and butterflies back to a place once stiff with grief. They were not boys now. They were becoming men. Not the kind the world raised with belts and silence, but the kind Eleanor had built with patience, dignity, and truth. And yet, the world still waited at the edges, ready to test what she had grown. Walt was the first to falter, not because he was ungrateful or unkind, but because he still carried something heavy inside him. A shame he couldn't name, a need to prove he was worth what he had been given. He began visiting the saloon in town. Quiet at first, a drink, a game of cards. But it grew. Late nights. A bruise on his cheek one morning. Anger in his eyes Eleanor hadn't seen in years. One night, he didn't come home. Tommy cried. Joseph said nothing, only paced the porch with clenched fists. Eleanor waited. She didn't chase him. She didn't send Joseph to drag him back. She simply left the lamp burning in the front window and sat up in her chair, waiting. As long as it would take. He returned just before dawn, stumbling, ashamed, shoulders slumped like a boy again. She didn't scold him. She only said, "Did the world make you feel big or small?" Walt broke then. "I thought I had to be something more than just your boy," he whispered. Eleanor touched his face. "You were never just mine. You are yours now. That was the whole point." That morning, Joseph asked if he could buy more land, expand the ranch. Eleanor watched him speak with quiet pride. "You've grown into a man without letting the boy in you die. That is no small thing." Tommy stitched her name into a quilt for winter, tiny, careful letters in the corner. He didn't say why. He just draped it over her shoulders and kissed her hand. The first sign came in spring. Eleanor dropped a teacup. She didn't panic, just stared at the shattered porcelain like it had surprised her body more than her heart. Joseph noticed the tremble in her fingers before she did. Walt began chopping more firewood than usual. Tommy hovered when she walked down the stairs. She told them she was fine. But one morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains, Eleanor remained in bed. She smiled when Joseph entered. "You boys always were the sunrise I never thought I'd live to see." "Rest," he said softly. "There's still more to do," she replied, voice light. "Walt hasn't painted the fence. Tommy's rosies need lifting. And you haven't written that ledger report." Joseph took her hand. "We've got it now. You taught us how." That evening, the boys sat together on the porch. No longer orphans, no longer boys. They spoke little. But Joseph said, "She didn't rescue us. You know." Tommy nodded. "She raised us." Walt stared out across the fields. "She built us from scratch." When Eleanor returned to the parlor days later, dressed in her softest cream gown, her hair pinned with Tommy's lavender, the boys looked up in awe, like the first time they saw her at the station. She smiled and said, "You are not mine anymore. You are the world's. Go be gentle with it." Tommy tried to speak, but his throat caught. So Joseph stepped forward and said, "Not until you let us be yours a little longer." She laughed then, a sound the house hadn't heard in years, and the sound lingered long after the words had faded. In town, the whispers changed. "She raised them well," someone said. "Never seen boys turn out like that," said another. And a third whispered, "Maybe love can be taught, after all." When Eleanor's hands grew weak, it was Walt who carried her down the stairs. When her eyes dimmed, it was Joseph who read to her by firelight. When her voice faded, it was Tommy who sang her lullabies, soft, crooked tunes she'd once hummed while planting tomatoes. She had not raised sons. She had raised men who remembered. And when they said she had no heirs, they were wrong. She had 3, each one carrying her name, not by blood, but by becoming. The autumn air carried with it the scent of ripened apples and the promise of change. Eleanor's days were fewer now, though the boys never counted. They had learned that love wasn't measured by time, but by how deeply it could anchor the heart. And Eleanor had anchored them all. Her hands trembled more each day, the movements slower, softer. Yet, she still found ways to tend to the smallest things, the rose bushes, the soft hums that filled the space between silence. She would sit in the parlor, watching the fire dance, her fingers tracing the same quilt Tommy had made for her so long ago, the one with her name stitched in the corner. Each time the seasons turned, her energy drained just a little more. But it was always the same. She never asked them for help until it was necessary. The boys had grown into men she could never have dreamed of in her lonelier days. They carried her name with pride, though none of them had borne it by blood. They had inherited something far more important, a strength rooted in love and care. Joseph was a quiet force, like the earth itself. He managed the ranch with a firm hand but an open heart, always honoring the memory of the woman who had taught him that gentleness wasn't weakness, and that the best decisions were those that first served others. Walt, the once proud boy who had carried the weight of his mistakes, now stood tall not because of his size, but because of the space he had allowed love to fill in his chest. He spent his days not on the ranch, but in town, offering help when it was needed most, quietly fixing broken things, helping strangers with no thought of return. He had grown into the kind of man who understood that strength wasn't just in muscle, but in gentleness and quiet action. Tommy, the child with the most tender heart, had not grown bitter with age. He had become the light in their home, always aware of others' pain, always offering care when others couldn't see it. He had started a small garden at the edge of the property, growing not just flowers, but a sense of peace, a peace that reached beyond the land and touched everyone who came close. He never stopped believing that love could heal what time had broken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, not by accident, but by choice. The boys had finished their evening chores, and now they sat around her, just as they had when they were small. She smiled, though it was a thin smile, a weary one. "I'm not long for this world, boys," she said, her voice as soft as the autumn wind. None of them said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. They had learned long ago that words were sometimes just a way to delay what was true. Walt was the first to stand, though his legs shook with the weight of something unsaid. He bent down, taking her hand in his, just as he had when he was a child. "You gave us everything we never knew we needed," he said, his voice tight. "You showed us how to love, how to be kind when the world told us not to. You gave us the chance to be something good." Joseph, who had stood by her in silence for so long, finally spoke. "You made us men, not because of what we did, but because of what you made us believe we could do." Tommy, who had learned to express his heart better than most, simply held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for giving us everything." Eleanor, her face softening in the twilight, looked at each of them. They had become the men she had always hoped they would be. The boys who had stepped into her life, frightened and unloved, had become her legacy, a living, breathing proof of the love she had given them. "Boys," she said, with a quiet smile, "you were my legacy. I am only the beginning. You carry it forward." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke again, "And I am not afraid, because I know you will carry it well." Joseph kissed her forehead, Walt knelt by her side, and Tommy took the space beside her, offering the quilt he'd stitched with such care. They knew what they had been given, and what they had to give in return. The morning Eleanor passed, the entire house felt it. It wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. The house had grown quiet, not in the usual way, but in the way that happens when someone has lived a full, rich life and is ready to move on. The boys were with her, her men, every step of the way. When the final breath left her body, the sun had not yet risen, but the light had already begun to come, slowly, softly, through the windows. The same light that had warmed the ranch when they were small, the same light that had watched over them all, day after day. As they buried Eleanor under the old oak tree she had loved so much, the three brothers, now fully men, with lives and legacies of their own, stood together, their hands pressed to their chests in quiet respect. "She wasn't just a mother to us," Walt said quietly. "She was our chance, our second chance, the only one we ever had." Joseph nodded. "We carry that with us now. Everything she gave us, everything she believed we could become." Tommy looked out across the land. The sun had risen higher now, the same soft light that Eleanor had always loved bathing the world in warmth. "I think we're ready," he said, his voice steady. And as the seasons passed, they carried her legacy. With every decision, every act of kindness, every piece of land they tended and every flower they grew, they honored her, not as a ghost, but as a living, breathing part of them. They carried her love forward, and it was enough.